The room was filled with the soft hum of quiet voices. Guests moved in slow, solemn waves, dressed in black, their faces tight with sympathy. Every chair in the house was taken, and those who couldn't find a seat stood by the walls, whispering in low voices. Margaret Evans sat at the front, dressed in a long black lace dress that hugged her thin frame. Her hair was pinned back neatly, and her hands clutched a silk handkerchief, dabbing at eyes that held no real tears. Her lips trembled, and every now and then she let out a soft, practiced sigh. The guests leaned in closer, offering quiet words of sympathy, their hands brushing over hers with gentle squeezes. "She's holding up so well," someone whispered behind her. "She loved him dearly," another voice added. Margaret nodded weakly at their kind words, lowering her head just enough to seem fragile. But inside, her heart pounded against her ribs, not with sorrow, but with something darker. Because Margaret knew a truth no one else did. Richard wasn't dead. Not yet. Her eyes flickered to the large framed photo resting on the mantelpiece. Richard's smile stared back at her, frozen in time. To everyone else in the room, he was gone, lost at sea, a tragic accident. They spoke of him with admiration, their voices filled with regret. But Margaret only felt a deep, burning anger that simmered beneath the surface of her calm expression. She glanced around the room, her eyes scanning the faces, some genuine, some curious, others probably wondering how much money she'd inherited. If only they knew. Richard had never planned to leave her anything. For years she had lived in the shadow of his charm. To the outside world, Richard was the perfect husband, successful, generous, a man who had built an empire from nothing. But behind closed doors, he was a different man. Margaret still felt the sting of his words, sharp and cutting. She could still hear the way he laughed when she cried, the way his fingers dug into her arm when he was angry. She had stayed, hoping things would change. They never did. Richard controlled everything. Her money, her time, even her thoughts. He made sure she felt small, helpless, and for years Margaret believed she was, but not anymore. A soft cry broke the air, and Margaret turned to see Richard's mother wiping at her eyes with trembling hands. "He was a good man," she said to no one in particular, her voice thick with emotion. Margaret forced a tight smile and reached out, squeezing the older woman's hand gently. "Yes," she whispered, "he was." Lies came easily now. They had to. She stared at the large portrait of Richard hanging in the front of the room. His smile, so confident, so full of life, stared back at her. He thought he had won, thought he would disappear with all the money, leaving her with nothing. But Margaret had found out. And now, she was the one in control. Margaret swallowed back the small smirk threatening to break through. Today was a funeral, but it wasn't Richard's. Not yet. It was for the woman she used to be, the helpless wife, the obedient partner. That Margaret was gone, and soon Richard would be too. It all started one late night when Margaret was searching through Richard's office. She had been looking for some old bills when she noticed a locked drawer she had never paid much attention to before. Something about it felt off. Her hands trembled slightly as she searched through Richard's desk and found the small silver key hidden beneath a stack of papers. She unlocked the drawer and pulled it open, her eyes widening at what she found inside, a thick folder with her name on it. Her fingers hesitated before pulling it out. Inside, there were printed emails, travel documents, and a detailed insurance policy, one that listed him as deceased. Her hands trembled as she read through the emails. Richard had planned everything: a fake drowning off the Gulf of Guinea, a $2 million life insurance payout, and a new life in Dubai. But what made Margaret's hands shake wasn't just the money. It was the emails to another woman. "Lena," the messages read, "soon, baby, we'll have everything. She won't get a cent. Just a little longer, and we'll be together. The money will hit the account, and I'll come straight to you. Dubai is waiting." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Her chest ached, but not from sadness. Anger, hot and bitter, rose inside her. Richard wasn't just planning to fake his death. He was planning to leave her with nothing. He had already found someone else, and he was going to start a new life with her. For a long time, Margaret just sat there, staring at the papers in front of her. Her whole marriage had been a lie. The man she had loved, stood by and suffered for, had been planning to walk away as if she never existed. He had been planning to leave her with nothing. No money, no home, not even an explanation. He had never intended for her to be part of his future. Margaret's grip on the papers tightened. A sharp, cold anger bubbled up inside her, cutting through the years of fear and pain. He thought she was weak. He thought she would cry and accept it. But not this time. Instead of calling the police or confronting him, Margaret made a decision. She would go along with Richard's plan, at least for now. If he wanted a fake funeral, she would give him one. If he wanted her to believe he was dead, she would play the grieving widow. But when the money arrived, things would change. Over the next few weeks, Margaret pretended to know nothing. She cooked Richard's favourite meals, acted as the perfect wife, and even sat with him while he planned his business trips. But inside, she was watching, waiting. Then the day came. Richard's boat accident was all over the news. They said he had gone out for a solo trip, got caught in a storm, and was lost at sea. The police searched, but they never found his body. Margaret played her part well, weeping for the cameras and accepting sympathy from family and friends. She dressed in black, hosted the funeral he had so carefully planned, and stood at the front of the church with a sorrowful smile. When the insurance money was finally transferred into her account, Margaret stared at the number on the screen. $2 million. The weight of it made her chest rise and fall slowly. This was the moment Richard had been waiting for. And then, just as she expected, the call came. Her phone buzzed in the middle of the night, an unknown number flashing on the screen. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. She answered with a shaky voice. "Hello?" A familiar chuckle echoed through the line. "Maggie, it's me." Margaret swallowed hard. "Richard? Oh my God! Is this real? I thought you were dead." She let her voice tremble, adding just the right amount of fear and disbelief. "You did good, love," Richard said smoothly. "Just like I knew you would." His voice was full of confidence, as if he had everything under control. "We need to meet, Maggie, before things get too complicated." Margaret clenched her jaw, forcing herself to sound unsure. "Meet? Richard, what's going on? I don't understand." "Just trust me," he said. "I'll explain everything. There's a place, the beach house in Ada, tomorrow night. No one will see us." Margaret bit her lip, pretending to hesitate. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll come." She hung up the phone and stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was calm, her hands steady. She sat still for a long moment, staring at the dark phone screen. Her hands were cold, but her mind was racing. Richard thought he had won. He thought she was the same scared, obedient wife who would do whatever he wanted. But he was wrong. Margaret wasn't going to the beach house in Ada just to hand over the money and disappear. No, she had a plan of her own. Tomorrow night Richard would realize that he wasn't the only one with a plan. She stood up slowly, smoothing down her dress and walking to the kitchen. Her eyes landed on the small glass bottle tucked away behind the tea canisters. The poison inside was clear, odorless, and worked fast. Something she had researched late at night when sleep wouldn't come, when bruises still ached, and when she first started to wonder if she'd ever truly escape Richard. Margaret picked up the bottle and held it up to the light. She thought about the years of hurt, the lies, the betrayal. He had left her with nothing but scars, and now he wanted to take everything and run, not this time. She slipped the bottle into her purse, took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "Your move, Richard." The drive to the beach house felt longer than it should have. Margaret kept both hands on the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her eyes fixed on the winding road ahead. The sea stretched out beside her, dark and endless, waves crashing against the shore like a constant whisper in her ears. The sun was setting by the time she arrived. The beach house sat alone at the edge of the coastline, surrounded by tall grass and swaying palm trees. It looked peaceful, almost too peaceful, considering what was about to happen inside. Margaret parked the car and sat for a moment, staring at the small house. A single light glowed from inside, casting a faint yellow glow through the windows. He was here, waiting. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to breathe slowly. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and walked up the wooden steps to the door. Her black heels sank slightly into the sand as she walked toward the house, carrying a bottle of expensive champagne in one hand and 2 glasses in the other. Inside, Richard was already waiting. He stood by the window, dressed in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his usual smug grin plastered across his face. The years of being apart had done nothing to soften the sharpness in his eyes, the arrogance in his posture. Margaret smiled, her heart pounding but her face calm. "Richard," she said softly, holding up the bottle. "To new beginnings." He chuckled, stepping forward to take the bottle from her hands. "That's my girl, always so classy." He popped the cork and poured them both a glass, handing one to her. His fingers brushed against hers, but she held steady. They clinked their glasses and Richard took a long sip, sighing with satisfaction. "You handled everything perfectly, Maggie," he said, sitting down on the plush couch. "I knew you would." Margaret sat across from him, swirling her drink slowly, watching him. "You knew I'd handle things, or you knew I'd have no choice?" Her voice was light, but the weight of her words hung in the air. Richard leaned back, grinning. "Come on, don't be like that. We both knew how this would end. I get the money, and you—" He paused, taking another sip. "Well, you get to move on. It's better this way." Margaret tilted her head. "Better for you, maybe." He laughed, the same careless laugh she had heard too many times before. "Don't act surprised, Maggie. You knew I was always thinking ahead. You're tough. You'll land on your feet." Margaret's smile didn't waver, but her grip on the glass tightened. "No remorse at all, huh?" Richard shrugged. "Remorse? This is business, love. You knew what you signed up for." He drained the last of his drink, smacking his lips. "But hey, at least you got to play the grieving widow. I bet you looked good in black." Margaret's lips curled. "I did," she said softly. "But you won't get to see it again." Richard's brow furrowed slightly. "What does that mean?" He shifted in his seat, looking at her more closely. She watched him, her expression calm, patient. Then he coughed. A small, sudden cough at first. His hand went to his throat, his face scrunching up in confusion. Margaret leaned forward, placing her glass on the table. "It's funny, Richard," she said in a quiet voice. "I knew you'd betray me one day, so I prepared for it." Richard coughed again, harder this time. His eyes widened as he looked at the empty champagne glass in his hand, realization dawning too late. "Maggie." His voice came out strained, panicked. He tried to stand, but his legs wobbled beneath him. He stumbled, knocking over the glass, shattering it against the floor. What did you do?" he choked, his breathing ragged, his face turning pale. His hands clawed at his throat, his body convulsing. Margaret stood slowly, watching him with a cold, steady gaze. "I learned from the best," she said, stepping over the broken glass. "You always thought you were smarter. But you forgot one thing, Richard. I've been watching you for years." Richard collapsed onto the floor, his body twitching, his eyes locked onto hers, pleading, desperate. "Please, Maggie." She knelt beside him, brushing his damp hair away from his forehead with a tenderness that made her stomach turn. "You always said everything was just business," she whispered. "Well, so is this." Within moments, his struggling slowed. His chest stopped rising and falling. His eyes, once so full of confidence, now stared blankly at the ceiling. Margaret stood up, smoothing her dress. She exhaled deeply, staring down at him with an eerie calmness. It was over. Finally, truly over. But there was still work to do. She reached into her purse, pulled out a pair of gloves, and calmly dragged his body across the floor toward the back door. The car was already ready, the trunk lined and waiting. She had planned this down to the last detail, just like Richard had planned his escape. But tonight, it was her escape. As she shoved his body into the trunk and closed it with a firm thud, she took a deep breath. The sea roared in the distance, dark and endless, just like it had the night Richard was supposed to have drowned the first time. This time there would be no mistakes. Margaret slid into the driver's seat, adjusted the mirror and started the engine. The car rumbled to life, and she pulled onto the empty road, heading toward the cliffs. She didn't look back. Not once. The night air was cold and heavy as Margaret drove down the quiet coastal road. The car's headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating the narrow, winding path that led to the cliffs. The wind howled outside, shaking the trees and making the tall grass sway violently. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her heart steady but her mind racing. Richard's lifeless body lay in the trunk, wrapped tightly in a thick black tarp. He looked so small now, so helpless. For years he had towered over her, his presence filling every room, his voice always the loudest. But now he was just a heavy, silent weight in the back of the car. Margaret's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Not so smart now, are you, Richard?" she whispered to herself. As she neared the cliffs, the distant sound of crashing waves grew louder. The smell of salt filled the air, sharp and cold, reminding her of the night Richard had faked his own death. But tonight was different. This time, he wouldn't be coming back. Margaret parked the car near the edge, turning off the engine. She sat in the dark for a moment, staring out at the sea. The moon hung low, its pale light reflecting off the restless waves below. She could hear the water calling, ready to swallow its next secret. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped out. The wind whipped her hair around her face as she walked to the back of the car. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the trunk, revealing Richard's motionless form wrapped in the tarp. She stared down at him, waiting for something, regret, fear, maybe even sadness. But there was nothing, just relief. Margaret reached inside and grabbed the tarp, pulling with all her strength. Richard's body was heavier than she expected, and it took effort to drag him across the rough gravel toward the edge of the cliff. She stopped to catch her breath, wiping sweat from her forehead. Looking down, the waves crashed violently against the rocks below. It was the perfect place, remote, dark, and deep. No one would find him here. No one would ever know what had really happened. With one final push, she rolled the body over the edge. She watched as it disappeared into the black water below, swallowed by the sea without a trace. A soft splash echoed through the night, and then it was gone. Just like that. Margaret exhaled, feeling the weight lift off her shoulders. She stood there for a moment, staring out into the endless ocean, letting the cool wind wash over her. A part of her had always feared Richard, but now, standing here alone, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Freedom. She turned back to the car, dusting off her hands and adjusting her coat. There was no rush now. Everything was done. The plan had worked perfectly. Sliding back into the driver's seat, she started the engine and drove away from the cliffs, leaving Richard behind for good. As she drove down the dark road, she glanced at the empty passenger seat beside her. No more insults, no more orders, no more fear. The city lights came into view in the distance, growing brighter as she got closer. She smiled to herself, feeling lighter than she had in years. Richard was gone, and with him all the pain and betrayal. Tomorrow, she would be the grieving widow once more. She would sign the final papers, take the money, and walk away from the life she had once feared. But tonight, she was just Margaret, and Margaret had won. The morning sun shone brightly over the city, casting long shadows on the streets as Margaret walked into the lawyer's office. The receptionist, a kind-looking woman in her 50s, gave her a sympathetic smile. "Mrs. Evans, I'm so sorry for your loss," she said gently. Margaret nodded, offering a weak smile. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching her handbag tightly. She had practiced this expression in the mirror. Soft eyes, lips pressed together just enough to seem brave but still sad. It had to be perfect. The receptionist motioned to the door down the hall. "Mr. Thompson is ready for you." Margaret walked slowly, each step carefully measured. Her black dress clung to her frame, modest but elegant, the perfect choice for a grieving widow. Inside, Mr. Thompson, Richard's lawyer, stood up as she entered. He was a balding man with round glasses, and he looked at her with the same sympathy everyone else did. "Margaret," he said in a soothing voice, gesturing to the chair across from him, "please have a seat." She sank into the chair, folding her hands in her lap. "Thank you for seeing me," she said softly. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat and adjusted the stack of papers in front of him. "I know this must be a difficult time for you, but there are a few matters we need to finalize regarding Richard's estate." Margaret nodded, her eyes downcast. "Yes, of course," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He pushed the papers toward her, his tone careful. "Once you sign these, the assets will be officially transferred to your name. The insurance payout has already been approved, and Richard's accounts will be fully accessible to you." Margaret picked up the pen, her fingers trembling slightly for effect. She looked at the papers for a moment, pretending to hesitate. She imagined what Richard would say if he were here, how he would sneer at her, call her weak, tell her she could never handle things on her own. But Richard wasn't here. With a deep breath, she signed her name in smooth, careful strokes. Margaret Evans. The ink dried quickly, sealing her future. When she looked up, Mr. Thompson gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Richard left you well taken care of," he said. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. "He was a good man," she whispered, the words coming easily now. After finishing the formalities, Margaret stood up, shook Mr. Thompson's hand, and walked out of the office. The air outside felt different, lighter. She had done it. She was now a wealthy woman, with no one left to control her, no one left to hold her back. As she stepped onto the pavement, her phone buzzed in her purse. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A private number. Her heart skipped a beat, but she quickly reminded herself it was probably just another condolence call. She took a deep breath and answered. Before she could speak, a voice whispered from the other end, "Margaret, it's me." Her blood ran cold and she stopped in her tracks. The noise of the busy street faded around her, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. The voice was unmistakable. It was Richard. Margaret's fingers tightened around the phone, but she forced herself to stay calm. She looked around, scanning the crowd, the passing cars, the world moving on around her as if nothing had happened. "I'm not that easy to kill," the voice said again, soft but laced with amusement. Margaret's mind raced. No, it couldn't be. She had seen his lifeless body. She had rolled it into the sea. She had watched the waves take him. A cold shiver ran down her spine, but she refused to panic. Instead, she smiled, a small, knowing smile. Without a word, she ended the call and slipped the phone back into her purse. If Richard thought he could scare her, he was wrong. She adjusted her sunglasses, lifted her chin, and walked down the street, already planning her next move. The perfect widow always stayed one step ahead. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more great content. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let me know what you think. And don't forget to share this video with someone who might enjoy it too. See you in the next one.